The USS Theodore Roosevelt sat motionless in the choppy waters of the North Atlantic, her massive hull cutting an imposing figure against the gray Norfolk sky. But beneath her steel exterior, panic was brewing. For 18 hours, the carrier's primary engine had refused to restart, leaving 5,000 sailors stranded and a critical mission hanging in the balance. In the engine room, Commander Sarah Mitchell wiped sweat from her brow as she watched her team of elite engineers work frantically around the massive turbine. These were the Navy's best, MIT graduates, specialists flown in from 3 different bases, men and women who could troubleshoot million-dollar systems in their sleep. Yet here they stood, defeated by an engine that should have been routine to repair. "Ma'am, we've tried everything," Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez said, his voice strained with exhaustion. New ignition systems, fuel line replacements, even swapped out the entire control module. The engine turns over, but it won't catch. It's like something fundamental is wrong, but we can't identify what. Before continuing, give us a like and subscribe to discover more stories of unsung heroes whose true value shines brightest in our darkest moments. Admiral James Harrison stood in the command center 3 decks above, staring at reports that made his stomach churn. The Roosevelt was supposed to lead a NATO exercise that would demonstrate American naval power to allies and adversaries alike. Every hour of delay sent ripples through international waters, affecting diplomatic relationships and military positioning across 2 continents. "Sir, we've contacted every available expert," his aide reported. "The manufacturer's team is en route, but they won't arrive for another 6 hours. Even then, there's no guarantee they can solve what our people couldn't." Harrison rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of command pressing down like the ocean itself. That's when his communications officer approached hesitantly, holding a tablet with personnel records. "Admiral, there's someone unconventional we might consider." Frank Kowalski, retired chief warrant officer. He worked these exact engines for 32 years before his discharge in 2019. Harrison frowned, scrolling through the file. The photo showed a man in his late 50s, weathered face, bearing the kind of lines that came from decades at sea. But it was the discharge paperwork that caught his attention: medical retirement due to chronic back injury, and what the reports euphemistically called adjustment difficulties. "Where is he now?" Harrison asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know. "Living in a trailer park outside Virginia Beach, sir. Apparently he's had some troubles since leaving the Navy, drinking mostly. The local VA has been trying to help, but..." The officer's voice trailed off diplomatically. Harrison stared at the photograph. Frank Kowalski looked nothing like the polished engineers currently failing in his engine room. His service record, however, told a different story. 3 decades of flawless maintenance reports, engine repairs that saved ships and lives, commendations from commanders who trusted him with their most critical problems. The irony wasn't lost on Harrison. In a world increasingly dominated by computers and digital diagnostics, they might need to turn to a man who learned his trade with wrenches and intuition, someone whose hands had felt the heartbeat of these machines when they were first installed. "Get him on the phone," Harrison ordered. "If our million-dollar experts can't solve this, maybe it's time to remember that some problems require more than just expensive education." As his aide hurried away, Harrison looked out at the calm ocean surrounding his immobilized ship. Sometimes, he reflected, the Navy's greatest asset wasn't its technology or its training programs. Sometimes, it was the forgotten wisdom of an old sailor who understood that machines, like people, had souls that needed to be listened to rather than commanded. The call would change everything, though Harrison didn't know it yet. In a trailer park 20 miles away, Frank Kowalski was about to receive a summons that would test whether decades of experience could triumph over modern expertise, and whether a broken man could fix what others deemed unfixable. Frank Kowalski sat in his aluminum lawn chair outside his weather-beaten trailer, nursing his 3rd beer of the morning and watching seagulls fight over a discarded McDonald's bag. The Virginia Beach trailer park wasn't much to look at: cracked asphalt, rusted mailboxes, and the constant smell of salt air mixed with automotive exhaust. But it was quiet, which was all Frank wanted these days. The phone rang inside, its shrill tone cutting through the morning stillness. Frank ignored it, just as he'd ignored most calls for the past 6 months. Creditors, mostly, or well-meaning VA counselors trying to schedule appointments he wouldn't keep. The machine would pick up eventually, but the phone kept ringing and ringing. With a muttered curse, Frank hauled himself to his feet, his back protesting every movement. The pain had gotten worse since his discharge, or maybe he just noticed it more now that he didn't have engine noise to distract him. Inside the cramped trailer, he grabbed the receiver with more force than necessary. "Whatever you're selling, I ain't buying," he growled. "Chief Warrant Officer Kowalski." The voice was crisp, official, military. "That's former Chief Warrant Officer Kowalski. Who's asking?" "This is Admiral Harrison, commanding officer of the USS Theodore Roosevelt. We have a situation that requires your expertise." Frank laughed, a bitter sound. "My expertise? Admiral, in case nobody told you, the Navy and I had a disagreement about my future. They decided I was broken goods, and I decided they were probably right. Chief, I need you to listen carefully. We're dead in the water with an engine failure. My best engineers have been working for 18 hours, and they can't identify the problem. I'm told you know these systems better than anyone." Frank walked to his small kitchen window and stared out at the interstate, where traffic moved in endless streams toward destinations that mattered to other people. "Which engine?" "Port primary turbine, GE LM2500 series." Despite himself, Frank felt a familiar stirring. He'd installed those engines himself during the Roosevelt's construction, had nursed them through their first sea trials, had felt their rhythm in his bones for years. "What symptoms?" "Turns over but won't catch. They've replaced everything they can think of." Frank was quiet for a long moment, his mind automatically running through possibilities even as he told himself to hang up. The LM2500s were reliable workhorses, but they had quirks that couldn't be found in any manual, subtle vibrations that indicated bearing wear, fuel mixture irregularities that developed their own patterns over time. "Chief, are you still there?" "Yeah, I'm here." Frank rubbed his unshaven jaw. "Admiral, with all due respect, you've got engineers with more education than I ever had. Computer diagnostics that can measure things I can't even see. Why call an old drunk who can barely get out of bed most mornings?" Harrison's voice was steady, honest. "Because sometimes the most sophisticated tools miss what experience can catch. Because 32 years of listening to these engines might hear something that all our technology can't. And because, frankly, we're out of options." Frank closed his eyes. He could picture the engine room, could almost smell the familiar mixture of fuel, hydraulic fluid, and metal polish. For 6 months, he'd been telling himself he was done with all that, done with the responsibility, the pressure, the weight of knowing that other people's lives depended on his decisions. But engines didn't lie. They didn't play politics or worry about promotions. They just worked or didn't, and when they didn't, they usually had a reason. "If I come, and I'm not saying I will, I want full access. No committees, no supervisors looking over my shoulder, just me and the engine. Done. And I want it understood that I'm not coming back. This is one job, nothing more." "Understood." Frank stared at his reflection in the kitchen window, unshaven, wearing a stained t-shirt, looking every bit the washed-up veteran everyone expected him to be. Maybe that's all he was now, but maybe, just maybe, he still had one good repair left in him. "Send a car," he said finally, "and Admiral, you might want to warn your people that I don't look like much these days. Some of them might remember me from the old days, and they're going to be disappointed." "Chief," Harrison's voice carried a note of something Frank couldn't quite identify. Respect, maybe, or hope. "Right now, I don't care if you show up in a clown suit. I just need someone who can make that engine run." After hanging up, Frank stood in his trailer's silence for several minutes. Then he walked to his bedroom closet and pulled out a toolbox he hadn't opened in months, running his fingers over its scratched metal surface. Inside lay the instruments of his former life, each tool worn smooth by decades of use. The helicopter ride from Virginia Beach to the Roosevelt should have taken 20 minutes, but to Frank, it felt like traveling through time itself. As the carrier grew larger on the horizon, memories crashed over him like Atlantic waves. His first day aboard a destroyer, the satisfaction of a perfectly tuned engine, the brotherhood of men who trusted each other with their lives. Commander Mitchell was waiting on the flight deck when he landed, her crisp uniform and confident, bearing everything Frank remembered about Navy leadership. But her expression when she saw him was harder to interpret: surprise, maybe disappointment, carefully masked behind professional courtesy. Chief Kowalski, Commander Sarah Mitchell, Chief Engineering Officer. Her handshake was firm, but Frank caught the slight hesitation, the way her eyes took in his civilian clothes and graying beard. Just Frank these days, Commander. Led the way. The walk through the ship's corridors was a gauntlet of stares and whispers. Young sailors who'd heard stories about the legendary Chief Kowalski, seeing instead a man who looked like he might be more comfortable at a bus stop than in an engine room. Frank ignored them all, focusing instead on the familiar sounds of the ship, ventilation systems, distant machinery, the subtle vibrations that told him the Roosevelt was alive, just wounded. In the engine room, the scene was controlled chaos. A dozen engineers hunched over diagnostic equipment, their faces illuminated by the green glow of computer screens. The massive turbine sat silent in the center of it all, surrounded by opened access panels and disconnected components like a patient mid-surgery. Chief Rodriguez, Mitchell called to a tired-looking man near the turbine. "This is Frank Kowalski," the specialist Admiral Harrison requested. Rodriguez looked up from his tablet, and Frank saw the exact moment when recognition hit, followed immediately by confusion. This wasn't the Chief Kowalski of legend. This was just an old man with calloused hands and shadows under his eyes. "Sir, we've tried everything," Rodriguez began, launching into a detailed explanation of their troubleshooting efforts. Computer diagnostics, component replacements, fuel system analysis, the modern Navy's approach to problem-solving, systematic and thorough. Frank listened politely, but his attention was already elsewhere. He approached the turbine slowly, the way you might approach a sleeping animal. Placing his hand on the housing, he felt the metal's temperature, its subtle vibrations. Even silent, the engine was trying to tell him something. "Mind if I listen to it turn over?" Frank asked. "We've done that dozens of times," one of the younger engineers muttered. "The starter engages, everything spins, but no ignition." Frank ignored him, positioning himself near the fuel control unit. "Hit the starter." The familiar whine filled the engine room as massive components began to spin. Frank closed his eyes, filtering out the voices around him, focusing entirely on the sound. There a slight irregularity in the spin cycle, barely perceptible but definitely there. "Again," he said. This time he moved to the air intake, listening to the way air flowed through the system. Then to the combustion chamber, placing his ear against the metal housing. The other engineers watched with expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed skepticism. "One more time," Frank requested, but now he was examining the fuel lines with his hands, feeling for vibrations that shouldn't be there. "Chief," Commander Mitchell said carefully, "we've analyzed every component. The fuel flow is within normal parameters, pressure is correct, mixture ratios are." "When did you last change the fuel filters?" Frank interrupted. Rodriguez consulted his tablet. 48 hours ago. "Brand new, high-efficiency models." Frank nodded, then asked a question that made everyone exchange glances. "What about the backup filters?" "Backup filters," Mitchell frowned. "The new system doesn't use backup filters. The primary filters are designed to handle all requirements." Frank was quiet for a moment, still touching various parts of the fuel system. "Commander, how long have you been working on these engines?" 3 years. I know this system inside and out." "And you, Rodriguez?" 5 years, sir. I helped install the upgrade systems. Frank straightened, his back protesting. And none of you were here when these engines were first commissioned. The silence was answer enough. See, here's the thing about the Roosevelt, Frank continued, his voice taking on the rhythm of a teacher who'd explained this concept countless times. She's got 30-year-old bones with a 21st century brain. When they upgraded the fuel systems, they removed the backup filters because the computers said they weren't necessary, but they left the bypass valves in place. He moved to a section of piping that the other engineers had barely looked at, a series of valves and gauges tucked behind the main fuel manifold. These old girls, they remember things, even when you tell them to forget. Frank's hands found a valve wheel covered in years of paint and corrosion. When there's a problem the computer can't solve, sometimes the engine tries to use systems that officially don't exist anymore. This valve is supposed to be permanently closed, but if the engine's struggling, it might try to draw fuel through the old backup line. He began turning the valve, his movements confident despite the stiffness in his shoulders. Problem is, that line hasn't been cleaned in years. It's probably got enough debris to choke a small car. Commander Mitchell stepped closer, her skepticism warring with hope. But the diagnostics would show irregular fuel flow if that were the case. Frank smiled for the first time since boarding the ship. Only if the computers knew to look for it. Some knowledge doesn't fit on hard drives, Commander. Sometimes you need someone who remembers when these machines were young. The backup fuel line hadn't been opened in over a decade, and it showed. When Frank finally disconnected the corroded coupling, a stream of contaminated fuel mixed with metal particles and what looked like organic sludge poured onto the deck. The smell was overwhelming, rancid hydrocarbons mixed with the metallic tang of corrosion. Jesus, Rodriguez muttered, covering his nose. How did you know? Frank was already examining the inside of the disconnected line with a small flashlight. Because I've seen this before. The Roosevelt isn't the first ship to have her fuel system upgraded. Every time they improve the computers, they forget to ask the old systems if they have anything to say about it. Commander Mitchell watched as Frank methodically inspected each section of the forgotten fuel line. Her initial skepticism had evolved into something closer to fascination. This wasn't how modern naval engineering worked. There were protocols, diagnostic trees, systematic approaches that ensured nothing was missed. Yet somehow, this weathered man with his intuitive methods had found their problem in 20 minutes. The contamination is worse than I thought, Frank continued, running his finger along the inside of a pipe section. Looks like water got in somehow, probably during a storm when the ship was taking heavy seas. With the valve supposed to be permanently closed, nobody bothered to maintain drainage in this section. One of the younger engineers, a lieutenant whose name tag read Patterson, stepped forward. But sir, even if that line is blocked, it shouldn't affect the primary fuel system. They're completely separate circuits. Frank looked at him with something that might have been fondness. You're thinking like a computer, son. In theory, you're absolutely right, but engines aren't theoretical. They're temperamental old beasts with memories longer than most of the people who work on them. He moved back to the main turbine housing, placing his hand on the fuel control unit. See, when this engine was first installed, it learned to breathe through both systems. Even after the upgrade, part of its control programming still expects that backup line to be available during startup. When it can't draw from both sources, it hesitates, just enough to prevent ignition. Frank began reassembling the cleaned fuel line components with movements that spoke of decades of practice. His hands worked independently of his conscious thought, muscle memory guiding every connection. It's like trying to breathe through your nose when you've got a cold. You can do it, but not quite well enough to get what you need. The work took 2 hours, cleaning, flushing, replacing degraded seals, and testing each connection. Frank worked mostly in silence, occasionally asking for specific tools or requesting that someone hold a flashlight. The engine room crew watched with growing respect as the old chief transformed their high-tech problem into basic mechanical maintenance. There's something else, Frank said as he made the final connections. Rodriguez, you mentioned the engine turns over but won't catch. How long does it typically spin before giving up? About 15 seconds. Standard startup protocol. Frank nodded, wiping his hands on a rag that had seen better days. That's your second problem. These old turbines, especially after they've been sitting cold, sometimes need a little more patience. The computer gives up too quickly. He moved to the control panel, his fingers finding switches and controls with the confidence of a pianist at his instrument. When I restart her, I'm going to override the automatic shutdown. Let her spin for 30 seconds. Give the fuel system time to fully pressurize through both circuits. Commander Mitchell stepped closer. Chief, the safety protocols will kick in if anything actually goes wrong, Frank finished. But sometimes you have to trust the machine to remember what it knows, even when the computer doesn't. The moment of truth arrived with less fanfare than anyone expected. Frank simply placed his hand on the starter control and looked around at the assembled engineers. Might want to step back. If I'm wrong about this, she could backfire pretty impressively. The turbine began its familiar whine, but this time Frank didn't lift his finger from the control when the computer tried to shut it down. 15 seconds passed, then 20. At 25 seconds, there was a subtle change in the sound, a deeper note that spoke of fuel finding its way through long-dormant pathways. At 30 seconds, the engine caught. The sound was beautiful, a smooth, powerful roar that seemed to restore life to the entire ship. Frank felt the vibration through the deck plates, the familiar rhythm that had been the soundtrack to his adult life. Around him, the engineering crew erupted in cheers and congratulations, but Frank was focused entirely on the engine's voice, listening for any signs of distress or irregularity. She sounds perfect, Rodriguez said, his voice filled with wonder. Frank nodded, but his expression remained cautious. Give her 10 minutes to warm up, then run a full power test. Check all the parameters twice. An engine that's been sick sometimes needs a few minutes to remember how to be healthy. As the crew busied themselves with their tests and measurements, Commander Mitchell approached Frank quietly. How did you know, really? How did you know to look at a system that every manual said was obsolete? Frank was quiet for a moment, listening to the turbine's steady song. 32 years, Commander. 32 years of listening to these machines when they were happy, when they were struggling, when they were dying. You can't learn that from books or computers. You learn it by paying attention, by caring more about the machine than about being right. He paused, then added more softly, sometimes the most important knowledge is the kind that doesn't fit in official documentation. Sometimes you have to remember not just how things are supposed to work, but how they actually worked when someone cared enough to listen. 3 hours later, the USS Theodore Roosevelt was slicing through Atlantic swells at full power, her engines running smoother than they had in months. Admiral Harrison stood on the bridge, watching his ship's wake spread behind them in a perfect V, while below decks, the engine room hummed with the satisfied efficiency of machinery operating as it was meant to. Frank Kowalski sat alone in the ship's mess, nursing a cup of coffee that actually tasted like coffee, a luxury he'd forgotten during his months in the trailer park. The initial excitement of the repair had faded, replaced by a familiar emptiness. The job was done, the problem was solved. Now came the hard part, remembering why that used to matter. Commander Mitchell found him there, still in her work coveralls, her hair escaping from its regulation bun. She sat down across from him without invitation, studying his face with the same intensity she'd applied to engine diagnostics. "The Admiral wants to see you," she said, something about expressing the Navy's gratitude. Frank shrugged. "I fixed an engine, it's what I did anyway." "Is it really?" Mitchell leaned forward. "Because what I saw down there wasn't just technical knowledge, it was intuition, experience, and something else I can't quite name. You didn't just know how to fix that engine, you understood it." Frank stared into his coffee. 32 years will do that. And then what happened? Why are you living in a trailer park instead of training the next generation of engineers? The question hung in the air between them. Frank had been asked variations of it by VA counselors, by his few remaining friends, by the face in his bathroom mirror every morning. The official answer was medical discharge, chronic pain, difficulty adjusting to civilian life. The real answer was more complicated. You ever have something you're good at become something you can't escape from? Frank asked finally. Every problem, every crisis, every impossible situation they call Frank. Frank will figure it out. Frank always has the answer. He set down his coffee cup with more force than necessary. Except Frank is just a man who got old and tired and started making mistakes. And in the Navy, mistakes with engines can kill people. Mitchell was quiet for a moment. What kind of mistakes? Frank's laugh was bitter. The kind that happen when you start thinking you know more than the safety protocols exist for a reason. When you start taking shortcuts because you've done something 1,000 times before. I approved a repair shortcut on the USS Washington that could have been catastrophic if someone smarter than me hadn't caught it. But they did catch it. This time. But what about next time? What happens when my intuition is wrong, when my experience leads me astray? Frank stood up, suddenly restless. Better to walk away while people still remember you as someone who knew what he was doing. Admiral Harrison appeared in the mess doorway, his presence commanding even in the informal setting. Chief Kowalski, could I speak with you privately? They walked to Harrison's cabin in silence, Frank acutely aware of the ship's motion beneath his feet, the familiar sounds of a vessel at sea. Harrison closed the door and gestured to a chair, but Frank remained standing. The Roosevelt will make her schedule, Harrison began. Our NATO allies will see American naval power operating at full capacity. Diplomatic relationships that were strained by our delay are back on track. All because an old sailor remembered something that everyone else forgot. Frank waited for the gratitude, the handshake, the polite dismissal that would send him back to his trailer park exile. Instead, Harrison surprised him. I've been reviewing your service record, not just the official version, but the real one. 32 years of engines that worked when they shouldn't have, systems that ran past their limits because someone understood how to ask instead of demand. Harrison picked up a folder from his desk. I also read about the Washington incident, the repair shortcut that wasn't approved through proper channels, the potential safety issue that was identified during routine inspection. Frank tensed, waiting for judgment. What I found interesting, Harrison continued, was that your shortcut, while against protocol, was actually a more elegant solution than the standard procedure. The safety issue wasn't with your work, it was with documentation that didn't match the modification you'd made. Frank stared at the Admiral. So, you weren't taking dangerous shortcuts, Chief. You were solving problems that the official procedures couldn't handle. The mistake wasn't in your repair, it was in not trusting your own expertise enough to fight for proper documentation. Harrison opened the folder, revealing papers Frank didn't recognize. The Navy needs institutional memory, Chief. We need people who remember not just how things should work, but how they actually work when reality doesn't match the manual. We need teachers who can pass on intuition along with information. Frank felt something stirring in his chest, hope, maybe, or simply the recognition of being understood. Admiral, I'm 58 years old, living in a trailer park, and I haven't been sober every day for the past 6 months. And this morning, you solved a problem that stumped some of our best engineers, using knowledge that exists nowhere except in your experience. Harrison extended the folder. This is a contract position. Naval instructor, specialized systems, teaching the next generation not just how to maintain engines, but how to listen to them. Frank stared at the papers without taking them. Why? Because sometimes the most broken-looking man has the sharpest mind. Because experience trumps education when the stakes are real. And because the Navy can't afford to waste someone who understands that machines, like people, work best when someone cares enough to really know them. Outside the cabin windows, The Atlantic stretched endlessly under a clearing sky. Frank thought about the trailer park, about the bills he couldn't pay, about mornings that started with beer instead of coffee. Then he thought about the sound of an engine finally running true, about young engineers who might learn something valuable from an old sailor's mistakes and triumphs. He took the folder